The webinar has started. People are entering. Welcome, everyone. And then Autumn, I'm making you the host and I'm giving up all my power. Okay, we'll just give everybody a moment to get settled. It feels like, you know, like people come in slowly. It's like everyone's finding their seat.
Good. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good, thank you.
So it's good to be back with all of you. It feels like it's been a while, but I guess that's just because we've missed you, Carney. So welcome back from vacation. So really quick housekeeping for those of you who were not with us last time or might not remember, we do have live transcript going now. And if you click at the bottom of your screen, there should be a button that says live transcript, and you can turn on, those are auto-generated subtitles. And so no promises about how it's going to transcribe some technical terms, but hopefully that will help you out. And
Can I try one word?
Try.
Just see how it works. Wissenschaft des Judentums. How does it come out?
It says visit shaft to you.
Oh, too bad. Must be the way I pronounced it.
That was it. Anyway, so it's so great to be with all of you again. And hopefully, I think you know all of us. I am Rori Picker Neiss with the Jewish Community Relations Council, joined by Jim Bennett with Congregation Sher Emeth, Daniel Bogard at Central Reform Congregation, and Carney Rose at Congregation B'nai Emunah. Some of you have said that you don't always know where we match up, so that's who we all are. And I'm just going to dive in because today I want to really talk about pluralism with all of you, and I'm going to share in the chat. Some of this is based off of an article that Yehuda Kurtzer just put out in Hartman has a new journal called Sources, but it touches upon any one of us, I think, might say. I know for me personally, whenever I've studied with Yehuda, I always find he ends up somehow talking about things that I had already been thinking about, but I didn't know I was thinking about it, or I didn't realize that I had words to actually think about it. And so, so he has this really great piece about pluralism. And so I want to first of all start off by just saying, as a foundation, I think pluralism is a good thing. Like I want to be invested in pluralism, right? And I think what's important, because we might not all actually want to be invested in pluralism, though interestingly, we've all chosen to be here and hear this diversity of voices that we all have here. But so we've been like invested in it, and I guess I sort of, you know, I kind of like came up in a Jewish community where that's been part of the foundation, where we have institutions like JCRC, like federations, right, where we've done all of this work to try to create spaces where our different kinds of Judaisms have been able to take hold. And I see some people saying, please define it. And so I'm trying to unpack it, because I don't know that there is going to be one definition. But for me, I think that the way that I think about pluralism is this space where we can have this wide range, this plurality of Judaisms, of opinions, of experiences that all feel like they have a place within our community. Right? And the challenge that we have with pluralism is that in order to say, like even what I just said, right, a plurality of whatever it might be that's all within our community, even to say that second part within our community is to establish boundaries, right? So immediately, right, how do we define? So we've done a really great job of this, specifically, I think, around religious experience. I think that is something where we recognize that when we go to a federation event, that there's going to be people at that event who are going to have a very different Shabbat practice than I do, who are going to have a different understanding of God than I do, who are going to pray differently or not pray at all, or believe or not believe in very different ways than I would. And yet we've tried to create a space where there is food that is accessible. So whether or not, because all of the food is up to a standard that we all can agree on, or whether or not there are different spaces where at least I know I can find the food that I need, where the conversation is going to incorporate all of the different experiences, right? And we're going to recognize that there's Orthodox, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, right, all within our space, right? I think we've done a really good job of this in terms of religious experience, but where we're starting to find more and more challenges is whether or not we can have a pluralism of political ideas, or whether or not even it seems like where we start to play this game is around the boundary maintenance, for lack of a better term, right? Who even gets to be inside? So now it's not that my community is not pluralistic, it's that you're actually just not part of my community, which is why I may or may not have to actually include you. So that's, yeah, like I'm going to pass it to you in just a second, Carney. I guess I'm just like to lay like a start of it because that's right. I want to start with this premise that I think, and then I want to hear what you all think, right? I think that the more ideas that we have, the stronger we can become. Like that's the foundation I think I start with. I think that being challenged, being in conversation with all of you, I think it helps me to fine tune my own ideas. I don't feel threatened by it. I think our community is better the more voices that we have within it. And so I want to just start off even with, is pluralism still a value for us? And Carney, you were going to jump in, so why don't
I was going to jump in
and
and ask a question for clarification. I'd love to hear it from you first, Rory, but then maybe from the others as well. I want to relate a story that happened in the Middle Ages in 1995, just as I was graduating from rabbinical school. I had the great pleasure to work at that time at Klal. And at the time, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg was the president of Klal. It was before Erwin Kula took over. And of course, now Brad Hirschfeld is there as well. But I was sitting in a session with Rabbi Greenberg, and he asked the following question, which I think in some ways I'd love to hear us talk a little bit about here today, which is, how big is your pluralism? How big is your pluralism? And at first I didn't really understand the question, right? And then we started to discuss and debate this amongst the group. There were 12 of us who were kind of fellows there working together, having this conversation. And I quickly realized that my pluralism was pretty small at the time. Like what I counted in was basically what I was comfortable with. Maybe a little bit uncomfortable, not radically uncomfortable with, like essentially in my kishkas uncomfortable with. And those are the people who were within my catchment. And I realized, and I thank Yitz to this day for that, right? Really kind of blowing my mind and opening it up in a way to think more broadly about that. And I think that's one of the great ills, or one of the great challenges that we have in the Jewish community, is making the room, harchivi mekom oalech, right? Making the tent so much bigger, right? So that there's room for those who agree, those who disagree, even those that those we like, but those we don't like. And that's a real lesson in savlanut, in patience and in radical pluralism, as opposed to a kind of a general sense. So if we can use those terms, that story really resonated with me. And I think I still struggle with it to this day. Who is allowed in? Who has a voice? Who doesn't have a voice? Is there any limitation to who should come in and who should be left on the outside? Just finish with one other. I think I may have mentioned this once before. Dan Cohn Sherbrooke, who's a Reform rabbi in England, has a book on Judaism. And the last chapter of the book has the ideas of the branches of Judaism. And he has a menorah. And on one far end, he has Chabad, right? Like Chabad, right? And on the other far end, he has Messianic Judaism. And he makes the contention that these two messianic groups, right, are the edges of his pluralism as he sees it. Now, I'd have to ask myself the question, on this side, is Chabad in, and are Messianic Jews for Jesus like in? And he seems to be suggesting yes. And so the question that really challenged me, at least visually challenged me. How did I feel about the broadness of my pluralism? So I throw that out just because it came to mind, and I think it may be germane to this conversation, but only possibly.
No, that's great. And I want to just lift up what you just said in that, because I think, right, this understanding, which is something I feel really challenged by also, that if we're really doing pluralism right, we should all be somewhat uncomfortable, right? So we're all really good at, right? So I'm very comfortable experiencing different prayer services, right? Whether or not they have to be like the most meaningful prayer service, I'm very comfortable going into that. But then immediately, I can be proud of my pluralism, but it's the pluralism within my comfort zone, right? If we're actually including the wide range of ideas, then those ideas have to include the ideas that make us uncomfortable.
Rory, I find myself really reacting. I'm kind of stuck on it. One of your examples that you gave earlier, the idea of food, right? Bringing this out of politics. The most contentious, and I don't go to a lot of them, but the most contentious citywide rabbis meeting I've been to was the discussion about food for Sababa. It was quite contentious, right? You mentioned two different options and referred to them both as pluralism. The idea that there would be, kosher options available for all sorts of folks, whatever their kosher looked like, and everyone could go choose the option that worked for them, or an option where all of the food is of a kosher standard that everyone can agree to. I want to push back on that second example because I deeply do not believe that, the Jewish sort of toss-away phrase is that the fromest common denominator is pluralism. I just don't. But I think there is a core issue, a paradox at the core of pluralism, which is that what do we do about being pluralistically accepting with folks who themselves are not pluralists, right? And what ends up happening is that fromest common denominator phenomenon within the Jewish world. But there's nothing Jewish about this in particular, because the same thing happens writ large on, all of our communities on a global scale. And so I think a lot about this notion of, do we need to tolerate those who are not providing tolerance back to us? And my answer is no. So
can I jump in and pick up the baton, Daniel, where you ran and actually run a little further? And I want to push back, first of all, like some of the people who typed early on the question, please define pluralism. I think we are being ambiguous and somewhat obtuse about our use of the word. Are we talking, I have a couple of questions I just want to throw out. Are we talking about Jewish pluralism? Is that really what we're talking about? Or are we talking about some theoretical construct of pluralism, as Daniel said, writ large, meaning not just pluralism within our Jewish community, but an attitude and an openness and an open tent that extends to those, as Carney alluded to, who might not traditionally be allowed in the Jewish tent. For example, the Messianic Jewish community, or even others with whom we are very closely aligned, but who are not Jewish at all, or who are Jewishly adjacent. Or, as I've had some dialogue with this week, people in the Jewish community who say, you write us out of your pluralism by defining support for Israel and Zionism as a defining nature of the Jewish identity. And I want to just say, I personally am equally struggling in my life and my rabbinate with Jewish pluralism for some of the reasons Daniel and others of you have said, that it's hard to be pluralist, it's hard to be open and accepting and tolerant, even of those who are intolerant of me or of others that I want to welcome. And that is a problem in the Jewish community. We can give all sorts of examples of that, both as rabbis, as leaders, where fellow clergy in our community will not even sit down at the table with us and talk with us so that we can figure out how to be a pluralistic Jewish community on the one hand. And it's also equally our challenge when we think about pluralism in America or global pluralism. Like, where do the boundaries of our loyalties lie? Are we really only interested in Jewish pluralism? Really? I mean, we are surrounded by people who are not Jewish, and yet we should be highly pluralistic in our openness and acceptance of all human beings. And I think this very question of pluralism, I think from the article to which you allude, Rory, I think we're talking about Jewish pluralism, at least initially, but I want to challenge us not to limit it to Jewish pluralism.
So can I throw out a definition of what I'm operating with pluralism and see if you all are on the same page too? To me, pluralism means acknowledging that I can only have at best partial truth, and that you also can have partial truth, and that those partial truths, even when they seem to contradict, can still contain partial truths. To me, that's what it means to be a pluralist. We would love to hear your thoughts on that as a sort of definition.
I think that's actually very much, sorry, I would say though, Carney mentioned before, Yitzhak Greenberg, who's like one of the founders of pluralism in America. And I think that's like very much his definition. He talks about like if the world is a spectrum of 1 to 100, right? Like maybe I can access 10 to 20 and you might be able to see 65 to 75, right? But like we're all on this spectrum. And that actually, right, and that I think the next step in that is that in talking to each other and learning about each other, we actually are able to access all the more so, right? Because we're all somehow experiencing the spectrum, right? Or the classic story of the elephant, right? Like one person is reaching the leg of the elephant and thinks it's a tree trunk, and somebody else is touching the nose of the elephant and thinks that it's a I don't remember the exact story, right? You know, but like they're all describing a very different experiencing, not realizing that they're actually just touching a part of the whole. And I think that is like I think that's a very classic definition of the way that we think about pluralism in the Jewish community in America.
Right. So I just want to push a little harder. You guys can reject me or tell me I'm demanding something that is
before you speak or after you speak.
Yeah, either or both. Either or both. You know, I'm pretty sure that the word pluralism means a coexistence or openness of potentially contradictory points of view in the same community. And so we can have pluralism in Judaism if we're willing to tolerate it. We can also live in a pluralistic world, and you know, there's people who are very closely aligned with our values and our goals as a community that are not technically part of our Jewish community. But does pluralism extend to them, or is pluralism really only about just Jewish survival and Jewish coexistence? I just want to say, I think it's important to define that. Are we talking about Jewish pluralism, in which we're just really interested in how we as a Jewish community, as however we define it, are going to coexist with conflicting ideas because we share a common something, values, goals, civilization, I don't know what it is. Or are we talking about a society and ultimately a planet that is somehow pluralist?
So I will say, first of all, Jim, that your vision for a bigger pluralism is one that I surely share. But I also want to say the following, at least for me. And I what that old saying about, you know, when I was younger, I was going to change the entire world, right? And then, you know, maybe I'll change my little corner of it, and then maybe I'll change myself. I think, at least for me, in talking about this particular issue of pluralism, I want to start within the Jewish community, not as an end, but as a beginning. And it's palatable. It's something I can kind of put my arms around and feel that I can make a difference in. It's not my ultimate goal. Maybe it's a penultimate goal, right? It's a milestone along the way in making progress. And maybe I'm shooting too low for what you're hoping for, Jim, and that's fine. But I sort of feel like if I could start modeling this within our own Jewish community, and whatever lengths, you know, whatever concentric circles we want to draw out, we can then ultimately be an or goyim and teach the world how to do this. And in teaching the world how to do it, we'll be influenced by all those other traditions that we now encounter. You know, for me, at least it's a great challenge to be able to do this, right? Even the limited levels of pluralism. So I kind of own the fact that I have a limited orientation, but I feel like it's a starting ground. Like I want to walk before I run, and in all of this. And I think we could do it within our community. I wouldn't say hareze meshubach, you know, like I'm satisfied, but I think it's a great first step. And again, maybe an opportunity for teaching how we arrived at that. Again, it's little, it's small, it may be too myopic for you, but for me, I love that as an initial step.
For me, it's not too myopic. For me, it's unattainable. I actually think it's easy. No, I'm serious. I think it's easier to attain a pluralistic coexistence within as broadly as we go. But Daniel raised a really important question, like, are we expected to find a pluralistic coexistence with people who simply reject everything and anything that we stand for or the boundaries that we open? And I often feel, I'll just say this out loud, I often feel more closely aligned with many people who are not actually part of the Jewish community, but who share in a pluralistic, open way the values, the goals, the intentionalities of my faith as a liberal Jew, than I do an alignment with people who reject everything that I believe and stand for, and yet still are part of Am Yisrael, who are part of the Jewish people. I actually,
yeah, right on. Right.
So I want to, like, you're actually, this is exactly what I wanted to bring out, right? This is why I think we struggle with any one definition of pluralism, because these are all the challenges that pluralism brings up. And I want to also I want to add into this that to a certain extent, we exist in some pluralistic elements, right? Now, whether or not we in our day-to-day and certainly like JCRC strives to bring together a different wide swath of the community than each of your congregations, which also try to transcend diverse spectrums, and yet, in different, it's not even quite four-dimensional, right? Like we can kind of cut this in any way, where I think each of our institutions could talk about a certain kind of pluralism depending on what you label the spectrum, right? We all have a wide spectrum. And then if you label the spectrum differently, we could be really narrow in other directions, right? We all have some ways in which we're very pluralistic and some ways in which we're not very pluralistic. And I think those are all of the challenges. But I think even as we start talking about pluralism, I want to hone in on some of these challenges, because I think part of it is this question of, are these challenges worth trying to overcome, or are these challenges insurmountable? And then this broader question of, is there a greater goal, right? To Jim, even to what you said, right? This recognition that there are these people who are part of Am Yisrael, right? Or by the way, people who want to reject me, and I want to say to them, but is there a value to the fact that I'm still part of Am Yisrael, right? I want to flip that, because I think it's different for us to reject people, and it feels different for me when I feel rejected, right? I can't tell you the number of messages that either come directly to me or that have been forwarded to me through other individuals. And I don't know if some of you get that, right? But like one of the big critiques that we get for this series is people keep telling me that this is not diverse enough. And one of the big things that I get in particular, and I want to tell you, it really offends me, is that there's people who keep emailing to say, we need an Orthodox rabbi on here because we don't have an Orthodox voice, right? Which, like, that's other people decide. Now, whether or not, so I'm still get to be part of the Jewish people, but I don't get to be part of the Orthodox community. Somebody else has now told me, right, that I'm not Orthodox. And we could sort of, right, like, we can laugh about it in some ways, right? But it hurts, like, it does. It hurts every time I see it. And who gets to decide that, right? And so, right, where I want to be able to say back to these individuals, and sometimes I reply and sometimes I don't, depending on my own mood and how many times we've had this conversation already, right? But so that's why for me, right, it's also like, is there a value in saying to somebody that my dignity and humanity have a value and that they should also be invested in that, right? And then what's my obligation back to other people in that same sort of vein? And so in that, right, I think one of the ways that we've already highlighted, one of the challenges of pluralism is this question of, is pluralism, and I've seen this done both ways, and we use it in terms of pluralism, right? Is pluralism the totality of experiences that we want to somehow like reflect, or is it one experience that can encompass all other experiences? Right. So Daniel, you brought this up in terms of food, but I think that the example that really kind of brought it home for me was, I remember when I was kind of early on in my career, I was participating in a youth dialogue, Jewish Christian, Jewish Catholic international dialogue. We were in Rome, and I don't even remember now, but there weren't a lot. Maybe there was 25 Jews. And so 25 Jews meant we never had a minyan. because there was not 10 of anything that would agree on what the minyan was. And we were there over Rosh Chodesh. It was the first of the month. And somebody said, more so because we wanted, I think, to show the Catholics what a Jewish service would look like, right? So we got the mashgiach, who was like, there was somebody from the local Jewish community who was making sure that the food was kosher. And so someone convinced him to bring a Torah scroll. And there might have been, maybe there were like 4 or 5 of us that were Orthodox, but the vast majority of the Jews there wanted to do an egalitarian prayer. And I remember, first of all, there was like, right, like he wouldn't give the Torah unless they put up a mechitza. Like, and I remember him like kind of like literally wrestling to like, you know, and then people would sort of like move the curtain a little or whatever it was. But I remember having at one point, like some of the other participants who were trying to explain, right, where for me, growing up in the Orthodox community, it was exactly what you said, Daniel. It was from its common denominator. Everyone can pray that way. I can't pray the other way. So that's what we have to do. And it was the first time that someone had ever expressed to me that it went against their theology to pray in that way, right? That it was like a fundamental element, which I had not heard before in that time. Right, where for somebody to say like actually for him or her to pray in my space was offensive to how they understood themselves, their experience, their text, right, whatever it is. And so there's a way in which pluralism, when we want it to be this like inclusive, actually requires all of us to give up a piece of who we are, to somehow say that we have to sacrifice, and that we're sacrificing something for this greater good, which there is a benefit to that in a certain societal sense. Yehuda Kurtzer, when he lays it out, he talks about Yitz Greenberg in this vein coming out of a post-Holocaust theology and specifically wanting, right, like where his pluralism is a response to the Holocaust and saying that totalitarianism is evil. There can't be a singular truth because look what a singular truth can do, right? So there's that piece of it for Yitz Greenberg, right? There is something to be said about that tzimtzum, right? That sort of taking a little bit of ourselves, right? It doesn't have to only be me. I can sacrifice a piece of myself. But if that's all that we are, then suddenly we have this community that's flat, that doesn't have this beauty and this vibrancy that we get from actually being able to experience, right? Because suddenly this prayer service wasn't any of our prayer services, right? Like we didn't actually have right, when you do it in that way. And so there's a way in which we water it all down. And I want to just share one quick story about that, because I've been reflecting on this from my own experiences with JCRC, right? And so this came up just recently, and many of you would have probably even seen this, right? But a few months ago, I don't know what time is anymore, but a few months ago, I was asked to speak at the J Street National Conference to talk about the work that we were doing in St. Louis. I was incredibly proud to see our JCRC highlighted for the work that we're doing on building coalitions and advocacy. It was Pesach time. I recorded it because I remember I recorded it on Pesach. So there you go. That's when it was. A little bit after was when it was released. And there were people in the community who were very upset by it, right? Very upset because they felt that my role as a leader of the JCRC that's meant to represent the whole community, right? Whereas for me, like, I go to J Street programs, I go to APAC programs, I go to like, if you invite me and it's not too much money, I show up, more so if the food is good, but you know, I try to be, right? Like, I feel like my job is to have a finger in all the different pieces of the community. But there were people who said to me, you can't go, right? Like, I shouldn't be anywhere that would cause disagreement, right? Which to me though becomes the question of then where am I? Right? Because suddenly if you can't be anywhere, then you're nowhere, right? And there was a lot of pushback. I shouldn't say a lot, but there was some really vocal pushback from some individuals to say that was wrong, right? That I have to avoid controversial spaces. And so I think like that's one of the questions is like what, so I want to, I mean, we could talk about some of the other pitfalls, but I do want to like unpack this more in terms of, because there's a way in which like I think about like with our community, right? Or I even think about with like the JCC or the federations or institutions that we've created, right? Where there are parts of it. I don't want to say the totality. I think there's a lot of beauty in these institutions, right? But like, what are the ways that some of the programs that we've created have gotten so flattened as like that, like have we lost some of our vibrancy in the process.
Can I jump in and link what you just asked, Rory, to a comment that Julia made in the question and answer? While I agree with the risk or the danger maybe that Yuta Kurtz's article points out, and that you just alluded to too, of kind of a neutering or a flattening out or a destruction of the vibrancy of community if we flatten out too much. I think the flip side and another baseline that we have to decide whether we believe in or not. And right now, I fear that we in the Jewish community don't agree on this. And I think we in America don't agree on it. I think the Zionist conversation across the globe does not agree on it, is the fundamental baseline importance of decency and respect and kindness and compassion and listening in any communal contract. And if, while on the one hand, maybe the fear is that we will flatten out the community if we don't allow for diverse, very different points of view, if those points of view are not presented in a respectful and Jewish, ethically Jewish way, then I think we have to draw a line somewhere. And it seems we've lost the ability to draw that line in recent years. The Jewish community has forgotten how to coexist with each other and with others with fundamental kindness and respect and decency. And people feel that I fear that people feel their passion for their perspective on an issue or a practice gives them the right to forget about derech eretz, basic decent behavior that used to be just standard operating procedure. It was the way I was raised. It was the way I think most of us were taught. And it seems to have been cast to the side in the name of our passion for our faith or our position or our political ideology or our ritual practice. We get to scream at others and behave inappropriately towards them. And saying to somebody, the way you worship is simply unacceptable to me and I can't tolerate it, is just as bad as anything else. So the example you use, Rory, makes me very sad that a person who doesn't personally believe in prayer through a particular modality can't sit respectfully and allow others and be present in the presence of others who are worshiping God in a way that's foreign to them. That, you don't have to be disrespectful about it.
And when passion becomes hubris, right? That's, I think, when we reach the kind of levels that we found ourselves in, right? That none of this works without humility. I was hoping that word would come out, and maybe, Jim, that's what you were alluding to, right? And I think Daniel before, right? The notion of none of us has the absolute truth. Maybe we have at best portions of it. And I see some of that conversation happening in the chat. I would also just want to echo something I think that Jim started with, that very, very often we feel deeply connected to people of great faith who are passionate about their faith, who live out their faith in very strict and punctilious ways of other religious traditions, and yet they find it within their heart to be able to open themselves up to hear the partial truths or the truths of others, and it doesn't diminish them. They don't feel challenged by it. They feel interested, they feel engaged, they feel maybe this is another lens on the Holy One of Blessing that I hadn't considered before, and it enhances me, right? Because I see how another person appreciates it. Just as an example, in some conversations that I've had, people talk about their great love of Jesus and how they turn to Jesus with, and they pray in such fervent and honest ways. And I say to myself, halavai, right? Wouldn't it be wonderful? We felt the same passion in our own tefillah. Right, I remember Julius Lester of blessed memory, right? Julius Lester used to talk the way that he talked, and he brought together this African American tradition, right? And of course, he joined the Jewish people in his book, The Love Song, which was really an important book for me, reading it at one point. Just this real tremendous passion that he had, and he brought in. He said, the entire Jewish community could use this kind of passion. Not because the passion is hubris, but rather we have the ability to learn how to be passionate. And I think you said it before, Jim, and others have said it. I often feel more of a kinship with those individuals because they're passionate about what they do without having the arrogance to say that they've cornered the market on truth.
And look, let's just name it. Jews who say things like, I could never go into a church and pray in a church, which I've heard many, many times, and it's incomprehensible to me how we could say that. And observant Jews who refuse to come into a Reform or conservative synagogue when we are praying because somehow they find that offensive. And I think just both of those examples, among many others, Reform Jews who say, I'd never go to an Orthodox shul and daven there because I'm offended by the way they... All of that is such an example of what you're calling this hubris of rightness. And, I think true pluralism begins by letting go of that. It begins by letting go. Can I ask you
one really important question that relates to what Rory said? So, I remember being at the Hartman Institute, also a place where we never could get 200 rabbis to daven together, okay? Interestingly enough. And by the way, we didn't even try, okay? Because maybe that was one of those moments in time where we just made the decision that it's better, to be people of faith together without having to try to do our rituals together, right? Unity and uniformity are two very different things in this conversation, okay? But on the other hand, right, what do we do with a situation where we feel like this doesn't meet our needs? And I think the answer is go do your own thing elsewhere. Right? Like that, you don't have to do it all in the same place at the same time. And that's a kind of pluralism that I can live with. I can live with the fact that you prefer to daven in this kind of way, with this kind of format, with these kinds of words, with these kinds of rituals. I get it. I can respect that. What I'm asking for you from you is not to denigrate how I do what I do, and rather maybe even, and the kind of pluralism that I would hope for is maybe you can actually learn something from me within our own Jewish community and from outside the Jewish community, and think about how much meditation, Eastern traditions have accreted right into what we do now in all of our congregations, right? All the techniques that have been brought in because we've lived not in an integral, unified oneness, right? But rather in the plurality, in the beauty of the colors of the rainbow. And if we could foster that, right, without having to say we're going to do it all together. And it is a state of mind and a state of being. And again, I go back to my premise that if we could learn how to do that and model that within our own community, it would be really, really wonderful to be able to share it with the world. But maybe it's exactly the opposite. Maybe it's only by working out that we can move it in. I'm not sure. I guess I always hoped that we could hold on to the possibility of being an or goyim in that kind of way as well. So let add one last piece. Remember that old saying by Voltaire, right? I will disagree with you to the end, but I'll defend your right to say it like that. I probably got it wrong because Voltaire didn't say it in English. But anyhow, that concept to me is very, very, very important. I want people to feel that they can speak, not be shouted down, not be shamed, not be told that they don't belong in those spaces, not have their livelihoods threatened, not have their identities threatened, their self-worth threatened, which has happened in this community far too often and continues to happen in some benign ways, but it's in profoundly toxic ways as well, which really scares me. And I'm so glad that Rory brought this conversation, because there is a level of righteous indignation that I feel about this. Right? I know other people have righteous indignations about other kinds of things, but about this is the kind of stuff that drives me absolutely crazy.
So if I can bring a few boundary cases here that I'm hearing from all of you. First, we've got this example of traditional folks who won't daven in an egal minyan. And then you've got liberal folks who won't daven in a non-egal space. I first want to push back, and I think this shows the limits of my tolerance, and suggest that those are not morally equivalent positions, actually. That fundamentally this ends up becoming something akin to the Kol Isha, the voice of a woman debate, right? Where more and more, it's not just that the food needs to be glatt kosher, but that everyone can agree that a man can say Kiddush in a communal space, right? But maybe not a woman, maybe not a trans man. but a cis man, right? I don't find those to be morally equivalent positions. And then the other conversation I hear reverberating here is the vaccine discussion. We have a vaccinated only policy at CRC for coming inside of our space. And I don't believe that when you have a choice, being vaccinated and being unvaccinated are morally equivalent choices. I think one of them is a moral decision and one of them is not. And those are, all of these are examples of the boundaries of pluralism, certainly within my world. So I would love to hear some of your reactions to that. The only other voice I want to bring in is Yonatan Zunger, is a Israeli-American philosopher and software engineer, because of course he's like a Russell is how I think of him, Rory, right? He has this short essay, "Tolerance is not a moral precept," which makes the argument, which really has just spoken to me for years, that tolerance and pluralism should be understood fundamentally as a peace treaty, meaning they're not the goal. We're not working for a pluralistic society. Pluralism is a tool that allows us to get a peaceful society where individuals and communities can flourish. But tolerance is a peace treaty. It only works if we both agree to the terms. And we have no obligation, is his fundamental argument, to tolerate those that are being intolerant, that are not offering tolerance. And that to me is the fundamental moral distinction between someone who is vaccinated and is not vaccinated when they have a choice, and the difference between someone who won't daven in an egal minyan versus someone who won't daven in a non-egal minyan. So we'd love to hear some reactions.
So I would just ask a question about the egal thing. So would you say that a person who says, I will not daven in a non-egalitarian minyan is not being tolerant just as someone who says, I won't daven in an egal minyan?
I don't think they are morally equivalent choices, but I do think that they are both exploring the boundaries of pluralism. I love being in Jerusalem and going to all of these amazing shuls until I had it pointed out. And I can't believe I needed someone to point it out, but sometimes we're dense like that. Someone pointed out that, well, she couldn't go in and have that same experience in any of those places. Yeah. So no, I don't think that those are morally equivalent. But I do think it's easy to frame the discussion in a way that suggests that they're morally equivalent.
So I want to actually put a pin in this because I do want to come back to this question. I want to talk about the boundaries of it, and I want to put like a little bit of a hold on it, just a temporary hold, because what I think, like, particularly when it comes to the davening experience, and I would imagine you probably all have similar stories. Like, I have so often been in exactly this space, right, where whatever number of Jews it is, right, but like, there's 15 Jews, there's 20 Jews, there's 200 Jews, right, and we're just not even going to try, or we can't get a minyan because there's not one that we all can agree upon, with one exception that I've seen many times, like without fail, which is that there's somebody in the group that needs to say Kaddish. And then there's always been a minyan. And it's been that, right, which I think is also the distinction between, right, this is, I think, part of the distinctions that we need to make, because there's a difference between, and I think like Jim also took this in a slightly different direction, right? There's a difference between I can sit here respectfully to support you than when I need to see my own experience reflected, right? If all 200 of us need to pray in exactly the way that we want to pray, we're not going to actually get right. There's not going to be 10 people who are going to agree with me. But when somebody says, and this I think is also like to Carney's point, right? Like, and yeah, sometimes men and women, sometimes just men, right? Whatever it's been whatever, it's usually been that person's need. And that's where it's been about that like willingness to say, this isn't about me, right? This person, whether it's because this person was still within their year of mourning and they needed a regular minyan, which I've had, in my experience locally with Hartman, or whether we did an American Jewish World Service trip to Muchacuchca, Mexico, right? Like, it was just the 18 of us Jews in the middle of this Mayan village, right? And when somebody said that they had yortzeit for their father, then we all went to whatever it was that person needed. And I don't think that there were, I have to think back on it, but I'm not sure that there were, like, it involved us, some of us, saying like, we will stand here, right? I think like like, I don't think there were 10 Jews who wanted to pray in an egalitarian space, but there weren't like 10 men, like however the numbers ended up working out, right? It was that willingness, right? And so that I think also I want to really lift up, because I think this is also part of the tension, is that we're all in this community. So it's one thing for me to go to Carney's shul and say, okay, this isn't the place I typically go to, but I'm here for whatever reason. I heard Carney's going to give a brilliant sermon this Shabbat. I want to celebrate this every Shabbat. Sorry, Carney.
Sorry, another.
Yes, right. Right. I'm here to celebrate a B'nai Mitzvah. I'm here to celebrate whatever it is that I've come in. Right. I'm not coming into this space for me, much as the sermon's going to feed my soul, to be clear, right? But like, I've come in because I want, right? So I've acknowledged that, right? What happens though when we're talking about Jewish community, where I'm part of the Jewish community? So I'm not here to be respectful to the community. I'm here to be part of the community. And so now I have a vested interest in exactly what Daniel's saying in terms of the boundaries, right? So this is a piece of it. But what I want to say before I jump to the boundaries is that I want to really say that Jim and Carney, what you're pushing in this conversation is exactly what I want to push in this conversation. And it's what I want to push everybody who's listening to this conversation, which is that we need to be passionate about this. Like there needs to be a righteous indignation about this, because there is a righteous indignation about everything else, right? Like, I just feel like we don't have
maybe not so righteous. I'm sorry, not to correct you, but I think there's a non-righteous indignation about the other side. This is righteous
self-perceived righteous indignation. I'll accept that, right? Yeah. But I right, like, we don't have, and this applies not just in our Jewish community, right? Like, we don't have like a radical middle, right? Like, we have a world in which, right, like, there's people on extremes who are willing to go, who are willing to dedicate themselves to these ideologies. And I think the vast majority of people, including in our Jewish community, are people who are joining our discussion. Like, the number of people that I do hear from, for all that I said, that I hear from people who say, you don't have an Orthodox voice, I hear from a lot of people who say to me, I love that I get to hear another perspective. I've never met Daniel before, but it's so great to get to know him through this. I don't usually get exposed to a Reform or an Orthodox colleague, or whatever it might be, right? All of those things. I think we have those voices, but we don't get, like, I don't know that anger is quite the word, right? We don't get indignant about it. We don't say, right, for all that there's people who are like angry that I'm willing to go into certain spaces, I don't hear people who are angry that people are angry that I go into certain spaces, right? Like, because the people who think, oh yeah, like that's like a fine thing to do, tend to be more silent, right? They're not the ones who are then writing emails. They're not writing emails to me to say, right? I mean, like, none of us have ever gotten like that was a perfectly adequate speech you gave, right? Like, no, right? Like, you give a speech and people are like, that was amazing. Or they're like, I completely disagree with you. And people are not like, that was interesting. Like, it had a few mixed things. I have mixed feelings. I'm going to think about it more. We don't tend to hear those voices, but those exist. And sometimes that's our goal, right? Like, you heard some good things, some things that challenged you, and you're thinking about it, like, great, I love it. But we need to empower those voices, because otherwise what takes over are the people who are saying, never say that ever again, or only talk about that. And the people who are like, I like it sometimes and I don't like it other times, aren't taking the time. And I'll say, not only are they not taking the time to email me to tell me, but they're definitely not taking the time, as we were joking about before this, right? They're definitely not taking the time to email Carney to complain about me, or to email my board chair to right? Like, right? We have these.
Don't forget the Jewish Light.
And the Jewish Light and the head of the Federation and anybody else that they talk to, right? Like, I think that, like, for this, and Yehuda Kurtz, who talks about it in his argument, in his article, he says that part of what, if part of pluralism is about suppressing fundamentalism, like, if it is partially, which is not the totality of it, because we should talk about Daniel, actually, you did the Daniel Hartman, Auschwitz or Sinai, right? Like, David Hartman, sorry, pushes back against this, right? But if part of it is saying no one can have a total truth because totalitarianism is dangerous, if part of pluralism is saying we all have voices in it, then it suppresses passion. But if you don't actually replace that with another passion, if we're not passionate about being in community, then all we do is relegate it. We've silenced now our middle, we've watered down our whole experiences, and the only voices left are the voices of that unrighteous indignation.
Right. Harold Schurweiss once said, I was there when he said it, I'll remember it forever. He said, what's destroying us is not Jews for Jesus or Jews for this or Jews for that or Orthodox, conservative, reform. It's none of the labels. What's destroying us is Jews for nothing, right? When you have no opinion, when you have no passion, right? Bernie Lipnick, Zichrono Livracha, always used to say, if you stand for nothing, you fall for everything, right? The truth of the matter is that I want to hear passionate voices. I want to hear passionate, well-argued, thoughtful, and actually different opinions than my own. Because it's like steel on steel, they sharpen each other. I really feel that it sharpens my axe. In these conversations, when we agree, is lovely. But when we disagree, and when I hear something that's, I hadn't thought about that, and I just, if I can give you, you don't need my nechama, but can I give you just a little comfort? People hear you. People hear all of us, right? You know, I was driving around, I still see the signs from last year, Jim, I think it was last year, 2 years ago, you gave a sermon and the people put the sign out on the lawn. Like, people hear us. I know it. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes decades. I just did a wedding for somebody and the kid told me, I still remember when you told me and I thought you were crazy back then and now it makes a lot of sense to me, right? And I said, oh, well, I've given up that idea a long time ago, but that's a whole other story. But I just want to say that there should be some nechama here. I do not believe, I'm worried about it, but I do not believe that all is lost. We are not at the end of this game. We're in the middle of it. We're reaching a boiling point. And hapach nishbar v'anachnu nimlatnu, like it's broken, and now we need to escape from this trap that we've been in so that we can create the new normal, the new reality, which I hope will include an expanded notion of what pluralism can mean within and Bezrat Hashem someday without.
Carney, beautifully said, and I agree with you. And I just want to add to that, you know, my greatest sadness is when somebody comes, often in anger, and says, I don't agree with what you're saying or what you're doing, and so I'm leaving, and I'm going to go find someplace else. I really thought I wanted to be a part of your congregation or your group or whatever it is, but I'm going to go find someplace else that better aligns with what and that makes me very sad, because we, to the point of this article and this discussion, we will do that to our own detriment. We'll end up in our own echo chambers, which is what we have all witnessed happening in this nation over the last half decade or more, of everybody listening to only the news sources that they want to hear, or studying with the people they want to study with, or worshiping in the community with everybody who's exactly like them, or whatever. You can define it however you want. The end result of that is a community that has lost. But at the same time, I want to add to what you just beautifully framed for us, Carney, which is it has to be done. If we're going to remain in community with one another, with people with whom we disagree, we have to do it with basic derech eretz. We can't be screaming at people, and we also can't be demeaning people for their fundamental core commitments in life. To Daniel's point, you know, it is a problem to have a Jewish communal a Jewish community that cannot tolerate egalitarianism within its midst. It's a problem. It's a problem to have Jewish communities that, I'll bring back the Zionism debate. We cannot have a Jewish community that cannot tolerate people in our midst who may not define themselves by their love for or commitment to the nation state of Israel. We may have to find a way to, with respect and dignity and decency, welcome those who have different perspectives into our midst and not make them feel like they are not welcome and therefore they have to go find someplace else where they fit in better, because that's the message we're giving now. And when somebody comes to meet with me and says, I feel like I need to leave your congregation, that's my least desired outcome. I want them to stay and to feel respected and to be respectful in return.
I would just add, or maybe question, Jim, if you could clarify for me, if somebody comes to me and says that, right, this place no longer meets my spiritual needs, right, it is a possible response to them also, look, I hear what you're saying, and either A, you can help us create that here within this environment, But is there a moment in time, and at least I know it is for me, I've done this more and more in my more recent years, in my more mature stage of life, right? Rather than trying to get somebody to stay to wear a size 9 when they're a size 11 shoe, to say to them, let me give you the names and numbers of people where you might find the kind of community that you need. Because for me, what I'm most worried about is not the loss to my shul or my organization or my institution, but the loss to the Jewish people, right? And the loss for the person who leaves, who then is untethered to Judaism, to a spiritual discipline, whatever it is. Like, I want people to find their place. Look, here's a crazy story. I grew up with a young guy who decided that he was going to become a Buddhist, right? This guy was the worst of the worst, right? Every one of the things that you don't want your kid to do, he was doing, right? And I encountered him 15 years later. He had equanimity, he had direction, right? Like, he had a sense of who he was, and he had a mission for his life. And he felt good about himself and felt like he was a contributing member of society. So am I going to say to him, Shmulik, you've left the Jewish people? Is this or do I say, I'm so happy, Baruch Hashem, right? Thank God that the power that animates the universe allowed you to find some way to fill your internal spiritual cup. Does it hurt me for a moment when somebody leaves what I'm peddling? Absolutely, it hurts me. I would lie if I didn't say that it does. But on the other hand, I think part of our job, talk about tzimtzum in our pluralism, right? The diminution of ourself for something greater, that people can find things elsewhere, and that I have enough relationships like the ones of the four of us have cultivated over this. I got to say, I'm here a long time already, right? Not quite as long, 1 year less than Rabbi Bennett, right? Because we all had to move onto the same street to make things work. But I'll say that, when it's taken this on some level to raise this issue, and maybe it's because of what Jim said before. We are at a moment in time that we can go in one of two directions. We can actually continue to destroy ourselves without making room, and we will implode, or we can open ourselves up and be fructified by all of the elements that are out there within our community and beyond. And that's a question that I think is central to the life of the Jewish community. And when you say, Rabbi Bennett, about those Jews who are not Zionists, who see themselves as either neutral on Zionism or anti-Zionism, they shouldn't have a place within the Jewish tent. I disagree with them. I have fervently disagree with them. I think all of us do on some level disagree with them. But what we don't disagree with is their right to feel the way that they do. And by the way, they have lots of support from history, from important, profound leaders, rabbis and teachers and philosophers, right? They have an awful lot on their side to defend their position. Again, I disagree with them vehemently, but I support their right to feel that way. And I don't want them to feel as if they don't have space within the Jewish community.
So I want to throw out, first of all, how appreciative and how brave that I think it is, particularly Jim and Carney. Nothing against you, Rory, but the ways
we're the old guys. That's why we're
exactly.
The old guys.
Yeah. The Alta contingent on the panel. Yeah. No, really, the ways that the two of you have made sure that our Jewish community creates space for those folks is incredibly brave. It's a model for, I think, much of the American Jewish world, and it changes the fabric of our Jewish community. So thank you, genuinely, thank you both for that. I feel like it's rabbinic malpractice if we don't mention Hillel and Shammai as a part of this discussion. So I want to mention the classic text and then take a subversive read on it here, which I think speaks to what we're saying. There is this classic text, Hillel and Shammai, the two poles, right? They're schools, in some ways, the movements of ancient rabbinic Judaism. And there's a discussion that they argue, what is it, for 2 years, 3 years, that they're arguing until finally a divine voice comes down and says, these and these are the words of the living God, right? There is truth in both of these. And then it goes on to say, then why is it that we follow the halakha of Hillel, right? When Hillel says go left and Shammai goes right, for the vast majority of the times, we follow Hillel when you have to make a choice in one direction or another. And the answer is that Hillel studied the teachings of Shammai as well as their own. I think the cheap interpretation of this is that's why we all need to go and, watch MSNBC and Fox News. I actually think that my read on this, which is a more subversive read, is I think this is a text asking, why is it that we follow Hillel? And the answer is we don't follow Shammai. This is a text telling us not to follow fundamentalists, but to follow pluralists, that our leadership has to be pluralist, and that we ourselves should model our own behavior after those who are pluralists, right? We can study both, but when it comes to our behavior and how we actually act in the world, Shammai is not the model. And I think this is a text very much rejecting Shammai in fundamentalism.
I love the read, Rabbi Bogart, but can you help me with this? What do you do with the fact that it's Hillel La'olam Hazeh and Shammai La'olam Haba? What do you do with that? In other words, it's for this worldly reality as opposed to the next worldly reality. Now, I can solve my own question and say to you, I only live in this reality, right? My work is here. And I want to just use that as a springboard to say, our work is here now. This is the work that we need to be doing right now. And what's at stake is not our individual congregations or organizations or institutions. It is the entire ethos of the Jewish community at this moment in time. We will dictate whether we will be able to find ways to stay together and communicate with one another respectfully, passionately. I'll use the word without hubris, since I brought that up earlier. Or are we going to create a Jewish people that will not be able to have any semblance of achdut, of being together in some kind of way? And we will move off into little corners of the world, and we'll all make Shabbos for ourselves in ways that will be unhealthy for the Jewish people, both in terms of here and, of course, the worldwide Jewish community. And I want to bring into this conversation Israel as well. If the state of Israel cannot bear to hear both all of the support as well as the critiques that we have, then the state of Israel does not truly represent us. And that is a key element here in this conversation, at least for me, of pluralism. And so I just want to say that I'm going to answer my own question to say, we only live in this reality. Olam haba, Bezrat Hashem, none of us will see it for a long time to come. But if we can make this place a little bit like heaven on earth, that wouldn't be a bad piece of work for us in our years in active duty serving the Jewish people in the world.
I love your interpretation, Carney. And I also, Daniel, I want to thank you for saying what you said. Your so-called subversive read, it's not subversive at all. I think it's correct. I think Carney agrees as well. And I don't want to speak for you, Rory, but I think it's critically important at this time and moment in history, not only for us as Jews. This applies to life, to the human race, that we have got to take the Hillel approach, or to our own detriment and our ultimate destruction, not just the Jewish people, not just the state of Israel, but the planet on which we are living, if we don't start being more Hillel-like. And, maybe another way to resolve the Shammai nod is, if we ever make it to the world to come, then maybe Shammai's approach might work there. We're not going to worry about it.
So I am going to push back on this, because I think I hear you, Daniel, and I hear the tension in this, and I wrestle with it. I wrestle with what the boundaries of pluralism are, but I don't think pluralism can only be for pluralists, because then we're just our own echo chamber. But I actually think, like, this is, even to Jim's point, I've always found this in interfaith dialogue that I remember I took a class at one point with Professor Alan Brill, and he was talking about, he was trying to create this taxonomy of different Jewish theologies to compare to this taxonomy that Christians had created, a Christian scholar had created, right? And sort of like, so we have, what I'm trying to remember now, but, sort of like those who are it's not external and internal. There's exclusivist and inclusivist and pluralist and universalist and all of these other kinds of things, right? I grew up in an exclusivist community. Exclusivist meaning that our way was right and everybody else's way was wrong, right? Now, having grown up in that community, I could encounter an exclusivist Christian and they would have been 100% wrong, but I understood them, right? Like I understood that they thought I was 100% wrong, right? Like the difficulty, right? It's not hard, right? So even as like, it sounds like those are opposite ends of the extreme, like, you know, and maybe like an evangelical Christian who has absolute truth and parts of the Orthodox community that have absolute truth, we understood the fundamentals of what it was, right? So even though like it's sad for you that you just didn't learn what I learned and you have the wrong information, I understand that you live your life as if you have the correct information at the exclusion of everybody else. I don't think it's hard, right? It's easy to do a pluralism of pluralists, right? Because we're all invested in it. I think a real pluralism has to include fundamentalists. Like it has to include those who also disagree with the basic premise of pluralism. Now, I think the challenge in that is how do we do that in a way, as a lot of people are bringing up, of respect, right? Like that's where, for me, there's a fundamental of human dignity, right? Of you could believe that I'm completely wrong, but I still think that there's a way that I should be treated. There's still a place that I have within this. And I also want to say that I think our institutions, similarly, like every one of us doesn't have to be a pluralist. We all still pray in our own ways. We have our separate Shabbat services, right? Like, I don't need to think that I have to pray the way all of you pray to still think that you have the right to pray in the way that you do, right? Like, so like for me, like Daniel, I don't have a problem with the fact that CRC established at its policy that only vaccinated people can come into the building. I am invested though in making sure that the non-vaccinated in our community still have a place that they can go to. And it doesn't have to necessarily
can we challenge you on that? Because
no,
I think it's important to have the opportunity to ask that question. And I'm not saying on the vax issue, not vax issue, any of these issues, is it okay to say that by certain orientations and approaches, right, attitudinal, language that's utilized, styles of disagreement, that one makes themselves outside the tent, that one puts themselves outside the machane, right? That one puts themselves outside the camp of the Jewish people by virtue of the fact they have not played by rules of engagement that include kavod, right? Respect, dignity, honor, language.
It's even more fundamental than that. Can I just jump in? I want to add something to what Carney just said, Rory, in response to your comment. I really believe fundamentally, as a Reformed Jew, as an American, as a human being, in freedom. I really do believe it. I think people have fundamental freedom, autonomy, and I also firmly believe that my freedom ends where yours begins, and your freedom ends where mine begins. And somebody I'll just say this, as controversial as it may be, somebody choosing to endanger the health of other people is crossing the boundary of their right and freedom. I believe that about the right to carry weapons and to use them. And I believe that about the right for people to gather unsafely with a communicable disease that has been almost completely accepted by the scientific community to be an endangerment to the public health. So I don't believe there should be a place where unvaccinated people should be allowed to gather to pray and endanger each other and then bring their disease out into the society and endanger others.
So let me clarify. First of all, I'm not saying that I necessarily am invested in creating a gathering space. When gathering for me also could include a virtual space, right? I think that because and I'm not saying that everybody here needs to be the person. Like I don't think I have to endanger myself because of somebody else's fundamental right. But I do think though, right, to me, like I also appreciate some of what you're saying, Carney, but I think that I want to make a distinction between somebody putting themselves outside of maybe some of our institutions or maybe putting themselves outside of like some of the conversations versus outside of the community. I think outside of the community needs to be a high bar. Like, I do not think that that's something that any of us should take lightly. And so, like, look, I will tell you all honestly, there are people who have emailed me incredibly rude, inappropriate emails that I have replied to say, I will not engage in a conversation with you because you are not having a respectful conversation with me. But I would never, and I don't think any of you were saying this, right? So like, yeah, there are people who I've said, like, you can't be in this conversation because there's rules to this conversation. But I would never say to you that they're not Jewish, or that they're not right. Like, so I think we need to make these distinctions within this. I think that there are times where people put themselves out of, so I think we can all say, my prayer service is going to be this way. If you can't pray in this way, you don't have to participate in it. I think, because again, I don't think the pluralism should be one where
the language I would use to say that would have to be a language of love and a language of understanding and a language of respect.
Absolutely.
No, so because I want to make sure to understand what you're saying. I'm glad that you clarified it, because I think people might misunderstand you, and you're a very hush of a person in this community. Like, people will listen. I don't think you were saying that you wanted services somewhere for unvaccinated people. I want to make sure that what I'm saying, what I heard you saying was that they're not outside the camp of the Jewish people because they choose not to be vaccinated. And I think that's a very key point in this conversation. My pluralism is big enough to say that you're still within our catchment. We still love you. We still worry about you. If you were sick or hungry or homeless, we would care for you safely, okay, with masks on at a distance, maybe in a bubble. But one way or another, we would care for you. Okay, you have not lost, right? The question I have is, and I don't know if anybody wants to tackle this one, is there something that somebody could do that puts them not outside of the conversation of pluralism within the established Jewish community, but really outside of the Jewish people, that they have lost their right to communicate, to speak as a voice, that they should be sanctioned and censured? Do we ever reach that place? And I think that's where it becomes very, very difficult for me to put people literally in cherem, to excommunicate people in this day and age, right? Not for some religious trespass in the classic sense, but for the language, the violent, vile language that we see being disseminated by some individuals, the name calling and the castigation and the threatening and the defaming that we see happening in our world. That it's not just happening within our Jewish community in St. Louis or in the Jewish community, it's happening all over the world. And so I wonder, is there a time, does a person ever lose their status? So how big is that pluralism?
I think this is a crucial question, and I'm mindful of the time. So we're not going to be able, maybe this is like a to be continued in terms of that question. But what I just want to say to it, and then just give you all a chance for any final words on this, is that I think the answer might be yes. I mean, I think there are points, right? Like we have boundaries, right? Because there is this sense of who we are, and who we are is definitional. So there's what is in and what is out. But what I want to say, and sort of answering the opposite of your question, is I think we're doing it already as a community, and I think we're doing it too much. I think that has been our default, is to say, right? So it's easy. It's easy in some ways to say, to not be vaccinated is not Jewish. And it's much harder for me to grapple with what is it that I am in a Judaism that includes people who believe that they don't have to be vaccinated, right? Like, because I am, right? Like, because those people are Jewish, and I have to grapple. So it's really easy. It's easy for me because then my theology is clear. I have a theology that says exclusively A, B, or C. And actually, if this is about that sharpening, Carney, to use your imagery, then I have to be willing to be challenged by ideas that are different, and to recognize that I'm part of a community that I want to believe is strong enough to hold the difference. And I believe vehemently that we are stronger for holding that difference. And so that's going to be my final thought, and then I'll pass it to all of you for your final thoughts. But that I want us to be bigger, I want us to be better, I want us to be stronger, and I want us to have a passionate voice for that strength, because I honestly believe that it's that is much stronger than the fundamentalism that we see on those edges that make us so uncomfortable. I think the fundamentalism can be one-dimensional, because that fundamentalism cuts out all of us that don't agree with it. But we need a passionate voice to advocate for that. Jim?
I agree. I have to go in just a moment, but I agree, and yet I still believe that the mutual responsibility for the health and welfare of all human beings takes precedence over the vibrancy and the survival of the Jewish community. And I'm not sure I can go as far as you want me to go, Rory, and to say that everybody, of course people are Jewish. I'm not going to take away people's Jewishness. I don't have that power, nor would I exercise it if I did. But I do think community, civilization, gathering of human beings requires a social contract, and it requires an agreement to live in a social contract and to agree. And I think we have lost that in our current time. We have forgotten about our mutual responsibility for the individual and communal survival. And that's why we're witnessing the threat to our planet. And it's why we're witnessing the ongoing dragging on of this pandemic far longer than it should have dragged on. And so I think there are boundaries. And I think I look forward to the next iteration of this conversation when we can test those boundaries some more. But I want to end just by saying personally what others have said. I'm so grateful, not only for the opportunity for the four of us to do this, but also for so many people who are willing to engage and listen and talk to us in between these meetings. It's very powerful, and it's the beginning of change. And I'm grateful for that.
And Jim, I know you might jump off before we do all the final thoughts, but I'll just say my pluralism is big enough for you to disagree with me on that. Daniel?
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about the difference between the public square as a pluralist gathering point, whether we're talking the broad public square, the just Jewish communal public square here in St. Louis, and our individual institutions, and whether the institutions themselves all have to be pluralist. I'm not sure they have to be. In fact, I think that deals with the question of sort of the bland, the parv version of pluralism that we talked about before. But I want to bring in my Rebbe's voice, Susan Talvey. Outside of my parents, she's probably been the most influential person for me in my life. She was my rabbi at my bris, right? And hers is a voice that I can't not hear when it comes to this discussion of pluralism. And I want to suggest one of the models that CRC goes with, which is that we are a very distinctive place with very clear sense of what our values are. And to go back to what you said earlier, Carney, I think a place that's built on the idea that there are lots of other places that you can go if this isn't the right place for you, and that's wonderful, that there should be a vibrant assortment of options. But if folks want to join CRC as members, they have to come to a brunch first, or a virtual brunch these days. We don't provide the bagels anymore. And at that brunch, we talk about what our core values are, and we talk about what our community stands for. And we say, you don't have to believe these things, but you should know we're not going to change. That this community believes that Black Lives Matter. We believe that trans children must be protected. This is a community that believes that Medicaid should be expanded and that healthcare is a human right. And anyone can join CRC, but they should understand that this is who we are and we're not going to change. And I don't know. I wonder if that's not a model for what a pluralistic public square looks like too. That there are certain boundaries, and this goes back to our discussion, Rori. I'm not convinced it ever really works for pluralists and fundamentalists to sit at the same table. I think it short circuits pluralism. I think people from fundamentalist communities can sometimes come together in pluralistic ways. I think sometimes, like you said, that's easier with folks of different religious traditions even. But I don't believe that in genuine communal public square that you can have a healthy one when fundamentalism is also a part of it. I think ultimately it short circuits the whole thing, that the only common ground that I as a pluralist have with a fundamentalist is where they stand.
Thanks.
Oh.
Carney, you want to finish us out?
Sure, I'll just add something I put in the chat, which I want to talk about the difference between borders and boundaries. And borders, for me, are permeable, right? Boundaries are not. And I think it helps me, at least in this conversation of pluralism, to talk about the difference between my borders and my boundaries. My borders can be pierced. I can learn, I can expand, but my boundaries will never be, kind of fall by the wayside. If they do, then I stand for nothing. So I think there's something to be said there. I also just want to have a little moment of sacred envy for what Rabbi Bogart just said, which is, halavai, that we could have communities, congregations, organizations, institutions that could be so laser focused on mission, vision, and passion. And I think that it's wonderful to have places like CRC. It's also wonderful to have places that are broader, that can somehow or another allow for the pluralism to exist, not in another institution, but within its own institution. So to be that kind of place. And as a conservative rabbi, sort of sitting in the middle of all of this, right? It's interesting to me that one of the core fundamental principles of conservative Judaism, right? The former chancellor, Ismar Shorish, put out something called the sacred clusters. One of the sacred clusters of conservative Judaism is pluralism. It is the only denomination that actually defines itself in that way. That pluralism is a key element, at least according to Chancellor Shorish, a key aspect of being a conservative Jew is to be a pluralist. Now, how big that pluralism and what that pluralism, we could have that conversation, but to have it on the books, that it's a core principle for us as conservative Jews is consequential and significant. And I've got to say there are moments where that's really challenging and really hard within one institution. I'd like to kind of stamp my feet and say, I'm the rabbi and the Maharat. I'm going to decide how this is going to work. I had to learn how not to do that and to allow for a multivocal community to exist within so that I can model that without to the concentric circles again of the community and Bezrat Hashem, with God's help, the world at large. So I thank you once again. It's so wonderful to be with you. And for those of you that we won't see before the holidays, for those we will see, we'll talk soon. I guess I'm on for leading the next session.
Yeah, I guess so. So to be announced of what's coming next. But...
Absolutely. I mean, you will be hearing my Rosh Hashanah sermon over and over and over. No.
Well, thank you all for joining. And I really like, this is a charge. Now I'm like looking past my screen to all of you that I can't see to say, we're having this conversation, but I really do believe that whatever we build our community, like the foundations come from every person who's a part of our community. And so I want to leave this as a charge, like this fundamentalist pluralism. I don't know, we can come up with a better name for it, but
radical
pluralism. But we need these voices, because if this is going to be, if there is a value in us coming together and honing ideas, then we need that passion to shout louder, because we need these ideas to be better. And I think there is something, and I know I feel better for being in conversation with all of you, and I thank you all for it, and for all of you for joining us. So Shana Tova. It should be a wonderful new year as we start in Elul and head towards Rosh Hashanah, and more to come in the new year.
Thank you all. Thank you to Autumn for their help.
There.
Sorry, I was looking for the pronoun. I didn't see it there. So thanks,
I miss
Autumn.
that so much about in-person interactions, that we don't have people's names and pronouns.
Yeah,
it's only on Zoom. I want Zoom labels for everyone in person now.
We're going to project over people's heads.
Yes,
and you can actually manipulate it.
I'm in.
Autumn, you can stop that. Everyone doesn't need the Facebook.